I will be on page 17, and we will start out in just a couple of minutes at number 16. Page 17, number 16. There are a few things about the synagogue that I wasn't able to complete last week. The reason I spent a little time in the synagogue is because Jesus and the apostles were in synagogues all the time. And the little background of the synagogue I thought was apropos. There was no synagogue prior to the Babylonian captivity. We only read about them in the New Testament days. But scholars are agreed that the synagogue originated in the captivity because the Jews were so used to going to the temple and worshiping God that in the Babylonian captivity they didn't have a temple, so they would naturally get together in little groups, like cattle do, and other social animals. And this was the origin of the synagogue. Wherever there were 10 families, there had to be a synagogue. This was basically a rule that the Jews imposed upon themselves. There are two kinds of synagogues, if I may say it that way. One was called an oratory, one was called a synagogue. An oratory was an open-air synagogue. It's like us meeting out here in the field with no roof, no walls, or anything. When Paul went to Philippi, he encountered a woman by the name of Lydia and her entourage of women. She was in a very lucrative business, selling purple. And how they got that purple is very interesting. Anyway, so these women would always be by the riverside to pray. This was an oratory. And then years later, centuries later, they would put a building up and a roof on it, and it would be called a synagogue. Now, the word synagogue means gathering together. And that's exactly what they did in the Babylonian captivity. They gathered together in little groups like this. Many of us have been at house gatherings when we have little devotionals or little worship services, if you want to call them that. And so this was the origin of the synagogue. They believed that the synagogue was far more important than the temple. Now that seems strange to our thinking, but they said, the Jews contended that at the temple you offered sacrifices to God, and that's basically it. But in the synagogue, you prayed and you studied the law and you heard messages. And how many people spoke on the Sabbath day? Give you a hint. 7. Now, I don't know that they spoke, that the 7 spoke on the other 2 days. Now, what 3 days a week did the synagogue meet? Saturday was mandated. The other 2 were established by oral tradition. Mondays and Thursdays. Remember, they contend that Moses went up on Mount Sinai on Thursday to receive the second set of laws after he broke the first set, and he descended or came down Sinai on Monday. But again, this was oral tradition, oral law. When one entered the synagogue, he prayed. Before he even gets into this main auditorium, when he entered those doors, he prayed. He was praying as he was entering in order to consecrate the service. What else can you tell me when one was headed toward the synagogue? What was his mode of transportation, so to speak? He was walking, but how was he walking? Very fast. You always walk fast to the synagogue, and you left slowly. Now, what can you say about the leper? They had to be there before anybody else did. They had to get there early. Kind of like Glenda does here, all right? Before anybody else gets here. Then they had to take their place in that 6x6 cubicle, and then when services were over, they had to leave before anybody else left that door. Come first, leave first. And but I'm surprised that they really let lepers into the synagogue services, but they did. They did not consider leprosy contagious. They only cordoned them off or quarantined them because of defilement, not because of contagion. There was, as I said last week, there was no joking, talking, or anything like that. People wore their best attire and things like that. Do you have any questions on the synagogue?
I don't have a question, but in my mind, I have wondered, there was a captivity for 70 years. Well, most of them, you would think most of them, and I would say, what, 90-something% of them never came back. Or died in captivity. So then you have to give them, I guess, some kind of a lot of thought that some of them, when they came back to rebuild Jerusalem, I mean, the temple, then they were with God. I mean, God was with them. So the synagogue had a very important place in keeping the people in God's favor. Or the teachings that went on. So they were prepared, even the young ones that came back. They had come on, live a lifetime. But they still with God.
I think me and Carl might have more input on this. I never thought of it until you just said that, but to me it seemed like one of the purposes of the wilderness wandering was for that old rebellious generation to die. And I think maybe that could be one of the reasons God put them in captivity for 70 years, that that generation die and bring up a new one that he could get through to.
God had started over. He started over with flood. He started over with 70 years of captivity, pretty much. He started over when they brought it out in the future for the new generation.
Right. Which boggles our mind as to the patience of God. All right, very good point.
Kind of boggles my mind to try to contemplate the conversation that took place in that life. This generation that had been so rebellious and so disobedient, now as they're transitioning out of life and they're teaching their family members, how did we ever come up with Nehemiah? One who was so contrite and so repentant for the entire nation. I mean, hadn't we ever get to that point when we have this bunch that we
Yeah, one out of 50,000 or 100,000, one righteous.
Wonder what kind of conversations took place.
And especially, Carl, when the very prophet they refused to listen to was in. Here is Jeremiah right next to them. They wouldn't listen to him in Palestine. And he's right there. He could have said, I told you so. I don't know that he ever did that.
He was heartbroken over it.
He was.
Heartbroken. And so I just wonder what kind of conversations took place to prepare people to come back. We don't know all their motives for coming back to the promised land, but they did. And still, if they had had those types of conversations before they ever got carried away, they probably would have never got carried away.
Yeah, you take Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, how these guys retained their strong faith when they were, I'd say in the minority would be an understatement.
Just saturated by wickedness all around.
Exactly.
But when they came back, I think the one thing I remember the most about coming back, I guess, is Carl about that they finally found a copy of the law. And they read it, and everybody stood it for how long? I can't remember how long. While the law was being read.
Yeah, I know.
Morning and noon.
Yeah, when they, Josiah was reigning at that time, and they just immediately began reading that law. And that law was passed on to every king. The kings were supposedly religious leaders as well as civil rulers. Exactly. And so did the synagogues, later on in history. We're going to pick up now with page 17, number 16. In Matthew chapter 8, and the parallel account is in Luke chapter 7. We're dealing with a centurion. And this centurion has a servant who is sick. Now, in Matthew's account, the word for servant can be translated child. It can be a boy or a girl of a parent. But we know that he was a servant because in Luke 7, verse 3, the Greek word doulos there can only mean a bond servant. And it cannot possibly be a child. And then later on in the account in Luke 7, the word servant is used a second time. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 8 and pick out a few of the scriptures to highlight this story. So in verse 5, when he was entered into Capernaum, there came to him a synagogue. Now, I never knew a synagogue had legs. All right, we took him a centurion. Now, Luke's account says that he sent elders. The centurion didn't go. So what's the explanation? How can Matthew say the centurion went to him, and then Luke says the elders, he sent elders to them? Okay, on the authority of another. These elders were ambassadors, so to speak. When we have an ambassador in England or any other part of the world, he can say, the president is telling you. He is speaking with the full authority of the president. And that's exactly the take on Matthew chapter 8. Beseeching him and saying, Lord, my servant, here again I explain, we know that this is a bond servant, a slave, lying in the house, sick of the palsy. The word live, the original word live, means bedridden. He can't get out of bed. And this centurion loves him. And so he is doing everything within his power to see that this man is healed. And he is in my house, sick of the palsy. Palsy was far different than anything we have today. It was a paralytic shock that engulfed the entire body. Many times the patient died. The muscles would cramp, all your muscles in your body, not just one, say your left arm. And then they would become rigid, just like this wood. And then the limbs would begin freezing one by one. I'm not talking about one hand. I'm talking about a hand, and then it would lead to a limb, and it would lead to other paralysis throughout the body, and this eventually would kill most of these patients. So here we have a paralytic man, and he saith unto him, I will come and heal him. So these elders come to Jesus and say, our centurion wants you to heal him. Jesus says, okay, I will. So as Jesus is headed to the house of the centurion, what happens? He never reaches the house. Because the centurion sends friends, Luke sends friends, to Jesus to head him off and said, I'm not worthy to come to you, and you're not worthy to come to me. He knew he was a Gentile, and he believed that all Jews thought it was bad and sinful to enter into a Gentile's house. But he didn't know Jesus came to break the mold. Jesus entered into Gentiles' houses. He broke all these moral laws of the Jewish people. But the centurion didn't know that. And so these friends say, why don't you just speak the word, because we know you have the power to heal him at a distance. And then they give the illustration. Our master is a centurion with authority. He tells this soldier to do this, and he does it. He tells that soldier to do that, and he does it. And if you will speak the word to this disease, that disease will obey you. Well, Jesus accommodates him and speaks the word. And when the friends go back home, they find the servant whole. As Luke 7 verse 10 says. Now, the centurion. I said last week that today we were going to study or mention I said 7 centurions. Let me rephrase that. 7 accounts of centurions. There may have been 8 centurions. One of these accounts talks about 2 centurions, but he may have been one that was previously alluded to in the same chapter. Either way, we're dealing with 7 or 8 centurions. The centurion was the backbone of the Roman army. He was the elite man. He was greater than any general. The emperor had more respect for the centurion than he did any other officer or person in his military. Listen to what Plinius says, an ancient historian, regarding centurions. They must not be so much venturesome seekers after danger as men who can command, steady in action, and reliable. They ought not to be over anxious to rush into the fight, but when hard pressed, they must be ready to hold their ground and die at their posts. So these were men who tried to get along with everybody in their military as well as other nations. They did not want to be aggressive in their fighting, but if they were forced into a corner, they could fight their way out. All right, first of all, we have the centurion in Matthew 27, verse 54. Remember the scene of the cross? Jesus is on that cross, and what does this centurion at the base of the cross say? After he sees the earthquake, after he sees Jesus in his great patience and love for the people, after he hears Jesus say these 7 utterances from the cross, and all this, I don't know if he witnessed the resurrection of the dead, but the graves were open. Okay, the graves were open. So I don't know if he saw those graves open, but what did he conclude after seeing all of this? Truly, this is the Son of God. And as I said last week, all accounts of the centurions in the New Testament are spoken with authority, honor, and respect. These were the cream of the crop, so to speak, as the scriptures allude to them. The next centurion we read about is in Acts 10. And who is he? Cornelius. All right? Cornelius was a man who had a heart that God could work with. Now, be it understood that he was one who feared God. What does that term mean? He was a Gentile living faithfully under the law of patriarchy. He had as good a heart as Abraham did, as Nehemiah did. And that's why God singled these people out in the Bible, because he looks not on the outward man, but he looks on the inside. He looked on the inside and saw what kind of heart David had. And so Cornelius eventually is converted. Now remember, when Peter comes to him, Peter is not so much trying to convert him from his sins. He is basically saying, look, the law of patriarchy is coming to an end today. And the gospel of Christ is now going to take over, and that will be the one law all human beings are to obey. Whether you were a faithful patriarch or a faithful Jew, it's time now for all to obey the gospel. And that's what he was talking to Cornelius about. And what did Cornelius do? Did he question him? No. He immediately rendered obedience. And not only Cornelius, but who else?
His whole house.
His whole household. You talk about respect. Here are centurions who had the greatest respect from other people, if they were the right kind of centurions. And no telling how many were converted because of this one centurion. In Acts 23:17, let's turn to that passage just a moment. We read about a centurion that rescued Paul from the mob. We have to back up Acts 22. Paul is teaching in the synagogue. I've got that in my mind. He's teaching in the temple. And all the people are listening to him. And there are Jews from Asia that come down. They're hecklers. These are trying to ensnare. Wherever Paul went, there were Judaizers. A Judaizer was different from a Jew. A Judaizer was one who was paid to hound Paul. And they followed Paul around, and wherever he was, they were a nemesis. And these were your professional hecklers. A lot of the Jews didn't like what he said, but they didn't follow him around to heckle him. These Judaizers did. Well, these Asian Jews come down to Jerusalem. They're in the temple, and they accuse Paul falsely of bringing a Gentile into the temple. Trophimus. He didn't bring Trophimus into the temple, and so they arrest him. And they go out with intent to kill him. That's exactly spelled out in Acts 22. This is called the rebels' law. There were two kinds of punishments in Judaism. Now, you have three Sanhedrin. You have the greater, the lower, and the local. The greater, the small, and the local Sanhedrin. Then you have some tribunals. But the very first thing, when a person was charged with a crime, he was taken before the elders of the synagogue. These were judges. They weren't just religious leaders, they were judges. And then they would forward you to either a tribunal or the local Sanhedrin. And then they would eventually go to the great Sanhedrin, which would be equal to our Supreme Court. This was the process. All right? If found guilty, they could scourge you on the spot. And this kind of scourging was the kind that exposed. The word scourging doesn't always mean to expose those organs, but in criminal cases, it did. It always did. Many of them died under this scourging. But there was a chastising that they also did, which some translators say scourging. And it can only be translated chastising. Anyway, then there was the rebels' beating. And this is what takes place in Acts 22. The rebels' beating was carried out by the citizenry. And if Wayne was teaching something that was against Judaism, against the oral law of the Trinity, the traditions of the elders, something that is witnessed by other people, I could go up to him and grab him by the collar and take him, to the authorities. No lawyer, you can't hire a lawyer. It was the right of every citizen to do that. And that's what these Asian Jews did. They accosted Paul, and they were going to take him out and kill him. And then word got to Claudius Lysias, the chief captain of the soldiers who were stationed where? We're in the temple. In Jerusalem, but there was something on the northwest corner of that temple wall called Fort Antonia. They named it after Mark Antony. And in that fort was stationed a cohort of soldiers, 600. And Claudius Lysias was the captain of this cohort. So he goes down and he rescues Paul. Okay? Now this is not a centurion. But anyway, as you continue to read that account, Look at chapter 23, verse 17. In verse 16, but Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait. So here's what these conniving Jews were doing now. They found out that Claudius Lysias wanted the Sanhedrin to assemble there in the court of the temple, and then he would bring, well, at this time they weren't in the court, that Claudius Lysias would take Paul to the Sanhedrin, and the Jews thought, wait, as he is leading, as these soldiers are leading Paul to the Sanhedrin, we're going to lie in wait in these side streets, and we're going to jump out and kill him. Well, Paul's nephew caught wind of this. And now we pick up in verse 16. But Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, and he came and entered into the castle and told Paul. And Paul called unto him one of the centurions, who said, bring this young man unto the chief captain. The chief captain, the centurion was one man, the chief captain was Claudius Lysias. So anyway, the long story is that he was protected by the grace of God. The providence of God intervened in this particular point. All right, now there was, look at Acts chapter 23, 24. Let's start at 22. So the chief captain let the young man go after he told him this plot, charging him, do not tell any man what you have signified unto me. And he called unto him two of the centurions. Now here's my question. Was one of these centurions the one we read about in verse 17? I don't know. It could be two different ones, in which case there would be 8 centurions talked about in the New Testament. So he called unto him two centurions and said, make ready 200 soldiers to go as far as Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night. So they are headed to Caesarea. Why are they going to Caesarea? Okay. Remember, when Paul heads to Rome on his last voyage, he ships out from Caesarea. Caesarea is where the procurator lived. That was the Roman headquarters of Palestine, Caesarea. So 70 miles away. So they head northwest to Caesarea under the protection of this military escort. All right. Then in Matthew chapter 8, we're talking about this centurion whose servant was sick and whom Jesus healed. So those are the 7, possibly 8 centurions that are notably talked about in the New Testament. Let's go back to Acts chapter 8, verse 5. Well, we've already read verse 5. And it says that he lieth in the house sick of the palsy. That word in Greek means he was thrown down in the house paralytic. He was thrown down in the house paralytic. You know the poor man Lazarus that was, the King James says, laid at the gate of this rich man? The Greek says he was thrown. Same word, he was thrown. He was just pitched out like a bag of trash. They didn't have any respect for these kinds of people. And the centurion answered, so we have this story about Jesus going, Cornelius, the centurion heads him off, says, I'm a Gentile, and you're not worthy to come into my house. But Jesus heals him, and immediately after the healing, which ends Luke 7, verse 10, we pick up with the wedding in Cana of Galilee. That's where the wedding took place. We're dealing with the raising of the son of the widow of Nain this time. So Jesus leaves Capernaum. And by the way, what did this centurion do? Not so much for Jesus healing his servant, but for how good the Jews were to him. What did he do to show his favor on them? He built a synagogue in Capernaum. And here's the interesting thing. Alfred Epstein says that there were 480 synagogues in Jerusalem. 1 mile by 5/8 of a mile. That was the size of Jerusalem. 480 synagogues. But in Capernaum, there was only one. How do I know that? Because the definite article "the" always precedes synagogue when he's talking about the synagogue of Capernaum, not any other synagogue. Unless it says Jesus went into the synagogue, meaning that particular one. But it's the one and only synagogue that existed in Capernaum, and it was done at the expense of this centurion. So now Jesus and his apostles are marching southwest to Nain, 25 miles away. And what do they observe as they approach the city of Nain? What do they see coming out of the gates of the city? A procession. What kind of procession? It was a funeral. Looking for my hanky. It was a funeral. Now, according to the Jews, and this is their oral tradition, everybody had to join a funeral procession or a wedding procession. Jesus and his apostles acquiesced to that oral law. And they joined this procession out of respect for the oral law. Jesus goes up to the woman. And what can you say about the woman? Give me some 2 or 3 traits regarding the identification of this woman. She was from the city of Nain. She was a citizen of Nain. But what was she? She was a widow. What does that mean? She had lost what? Her husband. But she also just lost what kind of son? Her only son. The very same Greek word that describes Jesus as being the only begotten of the Son of God. And so she had a double grief to experience. Now, there are a few things about death that I think I would like to point out. Hope you indulge me on this. Death was a religious burial of the decedent was a religious duty. Today we bury people out of respect. The law requires it, all that stuff. They did it because it was a religious duty. They believed in burying everybody, even the worthless criminal. Don't know that there's such a thing as a noble criminal, but anyway, even the worthless person deserved to be buried. 90% of their burials were in sepulchres. That is, rock-hewn tombs, either natural caves or hollowed out by man. And if, like Nicodemus, who owned one of these sepulchres, as you enter into that sepulchre, there are places for 8 bodies, 3 on each side that have been hollowed out, little niches, and 2 on the back wall. And so these Jews they did not believe in cremating. They said cremation was a heathen practice. It was of the devil. We preachers have a lot of people who talk to us about cremation. They have questions about cremation based upon their understanding of the old view that it's a heathen practice. Well, it's not a heathen practice. What do you say when somebody asks you about the belief? It's a choice. Because what has left the body? The soul. So you're dealing with a corpse that is going to what? It's going to rot, deteriorate, break down. So you are not cremating the soul. There are those who are in a pinch. Say, well, my loved one wrote it in print, I want to be cremated, but we want to have a full service. you do both. Because funeral homes have these rental caskets. And we've done a lot of these services. You have the full service, the casket up here, and then after everybody leaves, the funeral directors come and open that left end, the feet end, and they slide that slip out in which that body is laid. They take it to the crematory and it's burned to ashes. They put that casket back into the funeral room, into the casket room, for the next person who wants to rent. We've helped a lot of families out like this. They don't know this. They don't know this. So they now can rest satisfied that they honored their loved one by having all their friends come, but they honored that loved one also by fulfilling his wishes. You have any questions you want to ask so far?
Well, in some religious circles today, apparently they still decide that the body and they can't.
Right. I may have told you this, but I had a funeral one time. It was on Thursday. I always remember this. And the funeral directors came up, and we were all friends with these funeral directors. We're just like that, because we do so much business together. And it said, Ken, last night the family came and tried to steal his body to burn it. I said, really? They said, yeah. They were going to take the body out of the funeral home and burn it. This was the sons of the deceased. That was his daddy in that casket. And they didn't like their daddy for some reason. And they were going to burn him. They weren't going to give him the respect of a funeral. I had another funeral one. A friend of mine, a very close friend, died. And the boys wouldn't let the funeral take place. They were mad at their father. And so years later, when his wife died, I preached her funeral, and then I preached his right next to it. I was not going to let my friend die without being respected and honored. And I had some of the family members come up to me and say that they really appreciate that. The sons never said anything. All right, now back to death. Everyone on a funeral procession and on a wedding procession, they took the longest route so that everybody could pay due honor to the happy couple or to the deceased. Every man in that procession carried the pall. They called it a pall. B-I-E-R. And that's where we get pallbearers. Got it strictly from this, from the Jewish custom. And every man wanted the honor. I don't care if there were 100 men. They all carried that pall. And every time they changed, there would be wailing women, crying out lamentations. Not so if a woman was the deceiver, only if a man was the deceiver. Now remember, I said last week that even the poorest family had to pay 2 musicians and 1 mourning woman. All right. Now only women could be the mourners. There could not be male mourners, but there could be male musicians. And so when Jesus goes into some of these houses, the waiting women and the musicians are already there because they expect this person to die if he hasn't already died. All right? You want to ask anything? The first thing that the deceased did, the loved ones of the deceased did, let's say that my son died. All right. The first thing I would do is tear my clothes. I would wear an outer robe called a towel, and then I'd wear an inner tunic, an inner garment. Now, when the soldiers catch lots for Jesus' clothing. They only catch lots for the garment. He had 4 other pieces of clothing, and they divvied that out between them. They didn't catch lots for those. So this person either took their robe off, and when Peter was fishing, and it says he was naked, that means he had his tunic on, his inner garment. He had taken his robe off. They lift their robe and take it off, and then they tear their tunic 4 inches. It can't be anything else than 4 inches. If the deceased is a parent, the children could never mend that tear. But everybody else, that tear had to be mended, but after the 13th day. Can you see? Jesus was dealing with all of this kind of stuff. I mean, they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little nitpicking burdens they imposed upon everyone. Well, after that person tore their garment, they turned all the furniture upside down. All of it. They would not eat. If that survivor felt like they were going to faint, they had to have some kind of something to eat. They ate it either in the back room or in a neighbor's house, and they never offered a prayer for it. Never offered a prayer for it. I never have figured out why they turned the furniture upside down. Do you know anything about that? There were 2 mornings. There was a 7-day period of deep mourning, followed by a 30-day period of lighter mourning. During the 7-day period of deep mourning, the first 3 days, like this woman in Luke 7 who lost her only son, it was very outwardly expressed crying, loud. Everybody could hear her within a half mile. But the next 4 days, it was inward grief. Inward grief. During that time, they could not even study the law. They could not put their shoes on. They could not wash their bodies. They could not engage in conjugal sex. They could not conduct any business. I mean, it was just like it was a Sabbath day. Okay. Thank you all. Come on.